Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first masterclass for 2025. Um, Today, we're going to be taking a look at linked cases in Jadu Connect and how you can set those up and use them. So we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. So just to talk a little bit about what I mean by linked cases. So obviously in Jadu Connect, you can build any workflow you like effectively, and that can be as complex as you need it to be. But you may have instances where you have workflows where potentially you may have staff or services that need to manage a specific element of the process, but who shouldn't be able to have access to the whole case or see the whole process. So I'm thinking of things like potentially complaints where you might have a complaint that you're dealing with and you need to pass out different elements of that complaint to different service areas, but then you want them to just be able to deal with their own little bit and then feed it back into the main complaint. Or another example would be something like a job application, which is what I'm going to use for my example to show you, where you would potentially want to have some kind of case that you can farm out to managers for shortlisting, but set it up in a way that they can't see the full application. They can only see the shortlisting details. So what you can do effectively in Jadu Connect is from a single form submission in Jadu Central, you can generate multiple cases using different workflows. And you can effectively get those cases to talk to each other. So a bit like sort of parent and child cases, I guess is a good way to explain it. So in the example I'm going to run through, I'm going to show you a setup that I've created to generate a basic job application. When the form's submitted, it creates a full application case, and it will also create a shortlisting case. What that then allows the service area to do is, HR can potentially then go in and associate the shortlisting case and assign it to specific managers or groups to be able to go in and do the shortlisting. And then when a candidate is either shortlisted or rejected, it can then feed that decision back into the main job application workflow for the full application to move that on to the relevant status. So I'm hoping that makes sense. If I jump into Connect and go to cases, I've got a couple here that I set up earlier. So I've got a full job application case that's been submitted, and I've got an associated shortlisting case. If I go into either of these, you'll see that they're linked. So I've pushed in the shortlisting case reference into the full application. If I go into the shortlisting case, you'll see that there's the case reference for the actual full application. So if I have permission to view both cases, I can switch between the two. If I needed to assign a case to someone specific to just manage that case, one thing Connect allows you to do is, as a user, you may not have visibility of a certain service based on what group you're part of. However, that doesn't mean that you would never be able to interact with any cases that are created within that service. So in this instance, I've got, say, a HR service and just the HR group can see that, but I might need to pass this shortlisting application to a different group or a user who's in a different group who doesn't have permissions to view that service. So what I can do in Connect is I have the ability to assign groups or assign users directly to a case. And if you're assigned directly to a case, you don't need generic permissions to be able to view that service type and that workflow. You would just be able to see that individual case because it's been directly assigned to you. So in this case, we can see that for the shortlisting case, a shortlisting decision's been made to shortlist the candidate in this instance, and it's moved this case to the status of shortlisted. If I go into the full job application, we can see that that has also been moved to shortlisted. But this has effectively been done through one single form transition. So I'm going to jump in and show you how I've set the actual workflow up. So we've effectively got two workflows. We've got our full application workflow with its statuses, its transitions, forms, emails, rules, all the normal stuff. If I go to the forms, it's only a very basic form that I've set up, so I'm only capturing a couple of bits of data. So in the initial job application form, I'm just going to capture the applicant's name and details of their experience. And then what I've done is I've added to the edit form a linked case field. If I go into the workflow for the shortlisting case, again, I've got my transitions and my statuses, much simpler workflow in this case. For this one, I've got two forms. I've got my new form and my shortlisting decision form. If I go into the shortlist here, I've got a few more fields. So I'm not capturing the applicant's name here because we want this to be an anonymous shortlisting case so that we can shortlist just based on experience. I'm going to pass in a unique access code and I'll explain why that is in a moment. And I'm going to pass in the linked case reference. So in this instance, the linked case is being added as part of the initial case creation form. And when I show you the rules that I'm setting up in Jadu Central, you'll see why that is. So jumping to Jadu Central, if I go into my forms, let me just sign back in. If I go to my job application form, I've just set this up as a normal form. I've got my basic application details page capturing the applicant's name and experience. Obviously, a real life job application form will be far more complex. But where the linked case element comes into play is in how we configure our rules. So if I go into my rule, there are a couple of steps to this. So because I want to create two cases and effectively link them together, my first action when the form is submitted is it's going to create the full application case. And then I'm going to create the shortlisting case. Now, with these two, it's going to be possible for me at this point to pass in the reference for the full application into the shortlisting case. If I go into my template, you'll see that I'm getting the linked case reference from a previous action. So effectively, it's configured to look at the full application creation action and pull in the reference from that case as it's created. However, because I want to link both of them, there's no way of me actually linking the shortlisting case at the point that I create the full application because we don't have the reference at that point. So this is where I'm using the edit form on the full application. So the way this rule works to link the two cases together is it creates the full application. It then creates the shortlisting application, which pulls in the reference number from the full application to cross-reference them. And then what we're doing is we're editing the full application to take the reference number from the shortlisting case and push that into the full application case using the edit form. So I've got my linked case from a previous action there. So this is why when I go to connect, and if I just open these in a couple of different tabs so we can jump between them. On the full job application, I'm using the create form to capture the basic data, but then I've set the edit form up with the linked case field. But on this one, I'm capturing the linked case in the create form itself. So hopefully that makes sense. So effectively, when I create this, submit this form, it should generate two cases and then link both of them together. So let's go back and do that. If I fill in my form, some text in there for now. If I submit this form and then go back into Connect and go to cases, I've now got my full job application number 2 and my shortlisting application number 2, both coming in as this status of pending shortlisting. You can see here that it's created the case and then edited it to add the linked case reference. And in this one, it's just generated the initial creation form and created the linked case reference there. So hopefully this is making sense so far. I don't know if anyone's got any questions at this point. So at this point, I could go in as HR and I could assign this shortlisting case to the manager that needs to shortlist it, or to a group if there's a group that needs to manage the shortlisting. What that would effectively mean is that the manager responsible for shortlisting would be able to see this case to shortlist, but wouldn't be able to see this full application case. So there's no way of them sort of knowing who the candidate is or anything like that. So you can do the anonymous shortlisting. Now, when they make their decision, we want them to obviously update the shortlisting case. But at this point, what we want to happen is when they trigger the transition in this case, we also want it to transition the full application case. So the way we handle that is effectively through a secondary form in Jadu Central. So if I go back to my forms, you'll see I've got a shortlisting decision confirmation form. So what I've done here is, if I go into this page, I've put the shortlisting application here as a text field. Normally we'd put this in as a hidden field so that it's just sort of seamless in the background. I've put it in here so you can see what's going on in the background when we submit the form. So on this first page, when someone comes to the form, we're going to pre-fill the application reference from the shortlisting application. But we're going to get the user to manually enter the access code that we've generated. So if I go into the job application form, if you've not come across access codes before, I have a bit of logic in this form for access code, and this literally is generate access code, which is a predefined piece of logic in Jadu Central, and this will effectively just return a random 9 alphanumeric character string. So what we can do is I'm passing this into my shortlisting case, What we can then do in the shortlisting decision form is get the user to enter the access code. And then I have some logic in here that effectively I'm going to pull back the value of the access code field from the shortlisting application using the application reference. And then as a security check, I'm going to compare what's been pulled back as the value with what the user's entered. So if there's a mismatch between the access code they enter and the access code that's being pulled back from the case reference, there's potential there that they might be looking at, say, the wrong application and copying the wrong data into the form. So we don't want them to accidentally update the wrong application. So this does a matching exercise so that if there isn't a match, we can branch them to a dead end page to say that you've entered the incorrect access code. Please try again. If they get past that, then we're going to send them simply to a page that's going to ask for the decision. And on here, I've got a text field that I'm going to pull in the full application reference. Usually, as I said, with the shortlisting application, this would be a hidden field. But I'm using some logic to get the linked application field data from the case based on the shortlisting application reference. Now, to pass the shortlisting application reference in, as standard practice in Connect, we'll have set this up to use a redirect. So if I go into the workflow and go into my forms, you'll see I've got a redirect on my shortlisting decision form. So in this case, I'm going to redirect internal users to the internal view of the form, and I've got a placeholder on the end of my URL to pull across the case reference. So I'm using case reference as my key. If I go into my pages in my form, you'll see that I've got a pre-fill in here that's going to take that reference from the URL and pre-fill it into my shortlisting application field. So let me go to my shortlisting case. So what I want to do is I want to shortlist this candidate. So I'm going to click shortlist candidate. Before I do that, I'm just going to copy the access code. So you can see here, when I go to the internal view of the form, it's pulled in the shortlisting case reference. As I said, I've just made that visible so you can see what it's doing in the background, but effectively it's taken it from the URL up here and pre-populated it into a field. If I put in the wrong access code, it branches me to my dead end. It says details aren't correct and not validating. Please try again. So I can go back. And then if I paste in the correct access code, then it validates and lets me continue to the next page. Again, as you can see here, it's using my logic to pull in the reference from the shortlisting application that links to the full case. So if I go to the case itself, my piece of logic is looking at this case reference and pulling back the value for this field. Because I need both of the case references in order to transition both of the cases. So at this point, I'm going to say I'm going to shortlist the candidate. And then if I submit the form, what it should do is transition both of those cases. So if I come back to my cases tab, you can see that both of those cases are now listed as shortlisted. So at this point, in the process, everything could switch over to the full application to progress through to the final appointment of the candidate. So now that they've been shortlisted, they're invited for interview, or you can invite them for interview. But in terms of the shortlisting case, that's now reached its final status of shortlisted. So there's nothing more to do with that one. So in terms of the way that this is set up in the form, so I said I've got my pre-fill pulling in the shortlisting application reference from the URL. I've got a piece of logic that looks at what that value is and then returns an access code, which I can then validate. You don't have to do the access code bit. I've just added it in as a bit of an extra in terms of this process. But then I'm comparing the values of what the user enters with the value that's been pulled back from the case to check that there's a match. And then I've got another piece of logic that looks at the shortlisting application reference and pulls back the linked case reference. So because I then have those details in the form, if I go to my rule, I've set this up so when the user submits the form and they've said they want to shortlist the candidate, we want to trigger the shortlist transition in both cases. So I've got effectively two transitions set up. The first one using my shortlisting reference and passing through the shortlisting decision. And then my second one using the full application reference to transition the full application case. This is a fairly simple example where you've just got two linked cases. You can have multiple linked cases if you need in terms of the way a workflow might work. As I mentioned, an example of that may be something like a complaint where maybe it touches on multiple service areas. You want them each to just manage and handle their element of the complaint and then feed that back into a main complaint case. It's one of those elements of Connect that you potentially don't need to use very often, but it's useful to be aware that there is that ability to do it. In terms of masterclasses going forwards, we're planning on doing these on a monthly basis. What we would really love is if you had any suggestions about things you particularly want to cover. Thank you for your time, and I'll hopefully see some of you next month.